He was a ghost on the edge of America, a quiet stranger sitting at the end of a fog-soaked pier in Harbor Point, Oregon. The sheriff saw a threat. The town saw trouble. And the police did what they always do when words don't work fast enough. They sent in their most powerful weapon. A fully trained K9 sprinted down the boards, teeth ready, every muscle primed to take the stranger down. But when the German Shepherd reached him, it didn't attack. It froze. Then it whimpered, pressed its head into his hands, and refused every command. Because this wasn't just any drifter, and that was not just any dog. It was a reunion 5 years after the Navy had declared them both dead. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe so more people can hear what really happened on that foggy pier. Fog slid into Harbor Point, Oregon, in a slow gray sheet, swallowing the sea stacks and dulling the harbor lights. By noon, the public pier looked like it led straight into nothing. At the very end of that pier, a man sat on a cracked wooden bench and didn't move. Dark jeans, plain jacket, boots planted solidly shoulder-width apart. His back was straight, hands loose on his thighs, eyes fixed on the blank line where water disappeared into fog. He had been there since before dawn. No phone, no coffee, no smoke breaks. He sat like a statue posted at the edge of town. In Harbor Point, where strangers usually ask for directions or work by mid-morning, that was enough to make people nervous. Across the street, Harbor Point Diner threw a golden rectangle of light onto the wet pavement. Inside, cups clinked. Someone laughed at a joke that had made the rounds for 20 years. Ellie Harper stood behind the counter with a coffee pot in her hand, but her eyes were on the window. "Top off, Ellie?" Gus asked from his usual stool. His beard was white, his hands scarred from a lifetime on the boats. She poured on instinct. "Sure." Gus followed her gaze. "He still out there?" "Hasn't moved," she said quietly. "Not once." "Maybe he's just thinking," Gus tried, but even he didn't sound convinced. "People come stare at the ocean when they've got troubles." "Not like that," Ellie said. "Coast Guard boys sit like that when they've just seen something awful and don't know where to put it yet. Most of those boys came inside for hot coffee and noise. This man stayed in the fog. It didn't need mysteries sitting at the end of the dock." She set the pot down, wiped her hands on her apron, and went to the old phone by the kitchen door. "Port Harbor County Sheriff," came the answer. "Miller." "Brody, it's Ellie over at the diner," she said. "Everything's probably fine, but I'd feel better if you took a look at something." "That phrase never means fine," he replied, but she heard his chair scrape. "What have you got?" "There's a man on the public pier," Ellie said, watching the silhouette. "He's been there since sunrise. No food, no phone, nothing. Folks are getting jumpy." "Describe him." "Late 30s, dark hair, fit," she said. "He sits like he's on watch, not on vacation, too still." A pause, then a soft clink as he reached for his belt. "Okay," Sheriff Cole Miller said, his tone tightening. "I'm on my way." He hung up, clipped his sidearm on, grabbed his jacket, and stepped into the damp afternoon. Cole had been sheriff for just over a year. He still felt the weight of the badge every time someone used his title instead of his first name. A quiet town stayed quiet because someone walked toward the odd things before they turned into problems. The cruiser rolled down the hill, headlights faint in the fog. He parked short of the pier, killed the engine, and listened a moment to the creak of boats and the distant clang of a buoy. From here, the man looked carved into the end of the dock. No shiver, no restless shifting, no glance back toward town. Cole walked down the boards, boots thudding softly. "Evening," he called when he was close enough. "Bit cold to be enjoying the view, isn't it?" The stranger didn't look away from the water. "I don't mind the cold," he said. His voice was low and rough, like he wasn't used to using it much. "This is a public pier," Cole said, keeping his tone easy. "You're not breaking any law, but you've been here a long time, and people are wondering who you are. You got some ID, I can see." A beat of silence. "No? No ID at all?" Cole asked. "No." Cole exhaled slowly, breath turning white. "And your name?" Another small pause, like the man was choosing. "Dan?" "Dan what?" "Just Dan." Up close, Cole saw enough to know his first guess had been right. Boots laced with military neatness, not style. Hands nicked and rough from work that bit back. Eyes that kept flicking to the harbor without seeming to move. Look, Dan, Cole said, voice firming. We've had some odd activity around here lately. Gear missing off boats, unregistered skiffs on radar. You sitting out here all day staring at the water without a last name or ID doesn't help. I'm going to need you to come down to the station until we figure out who you are. At that, the man finally turned his head all the way. His eyes were pale gray, storm-colored, and steady. No fear. No anger. Just a cool measuring look, the kind you saw on people used to deciding fast. That's not gonna happen, he said quietly. He didn't shift his weight or square up. He just said it like a fact. Behind them, the diner door chimed. Ellie stepped outside, drying her hands on her apron, and two regulars drifted out behind her. A couple of phones appeared, held low. Far beyond the harbor mouth, half hidden in fog, a rust-scarred trawler rocked on the swell. If anyone had been watching with binoculars, they would have seen a small inflatable sliding toward the water. The man on the bench, Jack Mercer in the files locked on a federal server, saw it in the corner of his vision. His mission on paper was simple. Observe, confirm, report, stay invisible. Now a sheriff and a growing audience stood between him and the one thing he needed, freedom to move. Cole's thumb brushed the radio mic on his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Miller," he said. "I'm on the main pier with a non-compliant male refusing identification. Request K9 unit for non-lethal deterrence. Over." Static buzzed, then the dispatcher's voice came back thin and clear. "Copy, Sheriff. K9 en route. 10-minute ETA." The man on the bench didn't flinch, but his right hand closed into a slow, controlled fist. Up the hill, an engine changed pitch and turned toward the harbor. Harbor Point had just called in its sharpest teeth. The K9 unit rolled into Harbor Point, behind a curtain of fog and mist. From the diner window, Ellie Harper wiped her hands on her apron and watched the black SUV ease in behind Cole's cruiser. Gold letters on the side read, Harbor County Sheriff, K9. Inside, conversation dwindled to a hush. "That'll be the dog," Gus muttered. "Town's about to get a show." Ellie didn't smile. "I hope not." Out on the pier, Jack Mercer heard the SUV door slam before the sound reached most human ears. Training filed it with the creak of ropes and the thud of waves. He still didn't turn. His gaze stayed on the rust-stained trawler, half swallowed by fog. Cole shifted his weight. "Backup's here," he said. "So I hear?" Jack murmured. Boots thudded on wet planks. A woman's voice came through the gray. "Sheriff?" Cole glanced back. "Jenna, thanks for coming." Officer Jenna Reed walked up with her shoulders squared, vest snug, dark hair pulled into a tight bun. At her side trotted Harbor County's favorite weapon. The German Shepherd hit the pier like a coiled spring released. He landed light and sat on command without being asked, ears pricked, amber eyes already locked on the man at the end. His vest read K9, Titan. To the town, he was a deterrent. To Jenna, he was partner. To Jack, for now, he was one more variable in a mission that was slipping out of his hands. "What have we got?" Jenna asked. "Male, late 30s, Cole said. "Been here since before dawn. Won't give ID. Watching the harbor like he owns it." "Armed?" she asked. "Nothing visible. It's the calm that bothers me." "Copy?" Jenna's gaze settled on Jack. "Sir, I'm Officer Reed with the Sheriff's Office. This is Titan. If you cooperate, he stays right here. If you don't, I send him. Nobody wants that." Jack finally turned fully, meeting her eyes. There was no challenge there, just a clear, cool assessment. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said, "but I'm not going with you." The words were soft, but Jenna felt them like a closed door. She clicked her tongue. "Titan, watch." The shepherd's muscles bunched. A low rumble started deep in his chest. He leaned into the leash, eyes never leaving Jack. On the sidewalk above, people drifted out of the diner. Ellie, Gus, two teenagers holding their phones halfway up, a couple of deckhands and rubber boots. The town had come to see its problem handled. "Stand up, sir," Jenna ordered. "Hands where I can see them." For the first time all day, Jack rose from the bench. He did it in one smooth motion, palms open, fingers spread slightly. No sudden movements, no flinch. Up close, Jenna saw the faint white scars on his knuckles, the pale line along his jaw, the way his boots were laced with unconscious precision. Her training whispered a word. Military. "Closer," she told Titan. He surged forward, nails clicking on the damp boards, pulling hard enough to rock her stance. 10 feet. Jack's pulse climbed one notch. Behind him, he could feel the weight of Harbor Point's eyes. Behind the sheriff, the trawler Zodiac was a shadow slipping into the fog. 8 feet. A small wind curled in from the open water, carrying salt, diesel, old fish, and something else. It slid low along the boards, hit the dog's nose, and stayed. Titan inhaled. The growl cut off mid-vibration. His paws faltered. "Titan, forward!" Jenna snapped, surprised. He took one more automatic step, then his head lifted. Ears flared wide, nostrils working the air in short, urgent pulls. His whole body quivered with confusion. Jack felt the change like a temperature drop. Very slowly, he turned his right hand so the palm faced out. Fingers relaxed. He hadn't made that gesture in 5 years. Titan stopped. The leash went slack in Jenna's hand. "Titan," she warned, "heel." For the first time since she'd handled him, he didn't obey. Instead, he leaned away from her, stretching his neck toward the man on the pier. A thin, high whine slipped out of him, the sound of an animal standing at the edge of an old memory. Phones lowered. Nobody wanted to miss this with their own eyes. Jack swallowed against the tightness in his throat. In his mind, he saw a different horizon. Felt desert heat instead of coastal chill, heard the echo of an explosion under black water. He'd read the report. K9E4, Echo. Status. Killed in action. Equipment lost. But the scent in the wind said otherwise. "Easy, boy," he said, his voice dropping into a tone he had never used on any other dog. "Come here." Titan moved like gravity had shifted. He closed the last few feet not in a lunge, but in an awkward, eager push. His nose hit Jack's palm hard. He sniffed once, twice, then made a strangle sound that broke into a low, rolling groan. His tail slammed against Jack's leg. His body shook. "Titan!" Jenna gasped, grabbing for the leash. The collar slipped through her fingers. The shepherd pressed his head into Jack's thigh, then tried to climb closer, mouth opening and closing as small whimpers leaked out between his teeth. It was as if 5 years of waiting collapsed all at once. Jack's hand slid up into the thick fur at the base of his skull, fingers finding a familiar groove. He didn't care who heard him now. "Yeah," Jack whispered, his voice rough with something that sounded a lot like prayer. "I see you. I've got you, Echo." The name hung over the pier like a bell in the fog. Jenna Reed, who had called this dog Titan for 2 years, felt the world tilt under her feet. For a few seconds, Harbor Point forgot how to breathe. The big German shepherd stayed glued to Jack Mercer's leg, making low, broken sounds no one there had ever heard from a K9. His tail thumped, his whole body shook, and he pressed his head into Jack like he meant to crawl under his ribs and stay. Ellie Harper's hand stayed over her mouth. Sheriff Cole Miller stared, radio forgotten against his shoulder. "Jenna," he said at last, "control your dog." "I'm trying," Officer Jenna Reed answered, but the usual command in her voice was gone. She snapped the leash. "Titan, heel!" The dog flicked her a glance, muscles jumping at the familiar word, then shoved harder against Jack and whimpered again. He did not move away. Jenna's stomach dropped. "Easy, Echo," Jack murmured, fingers deep in the fur at the base of the dog's neck. He used the name again, gently. "I've got you." "That's not his name," Jenna blurted. "He's Titan." Jack met her eyes. "Not to him," he said. "Titan's what they called him when they thought his real life was over." A ripple moved through the small crowd. Jenna latched onto the only procedure that made sense. "Stay," she told the dog, then strode up the pier toward her SUV. Her hands shook as she dug through the gear bag until she found the small microchip scanner. Back at Jack's side, she knelt. The shepherd's eyes bounced between her and the man he leaned on. "It's okay, boy," Jack said softly. "Let her check." The scanner passed over the heavy muscle of the dog's neck. For a moment, there was only the creak of wet boards and the slap of water below. Then the device beeped. A line of letters and numbers appeared on the tiny screen. Jenna read once, then again. "K9E4, she said slowly. "Call sign Echo. Handler, Mercer, J Unit NSWG. Status." Her voice snagged. "Status?" Cole asked. She swallowed. "Status. Killed in action. Horn of Africa. 5 years ago. Killed in action." The words settled over the pier heavier than the fog. Even the teenagers with their phones tucked them away. From the back of the group came the soft tap of a cane. Hank Blackwood stepped forward, shoulders still broad under an old wool sweater, eyes sharp under his cap. People shifted to let him through. "You're all looking at that dog like a busted tool," Hank rasped, "like a patrol car with fur." Jenna straightened, scanner in her hand. "Sir, that file doesn't just say K9, Hank cut in, nodding toward the screen. "It says Echo. It lists a handler. That makes him a soldier, same as the man beside him." He looked straight at Jenna. "He ever flinch for no good reason?" Hank asked. "Engine backfires, crate drops, something hits the water wrong?" Jenna thought of training days, the rare moments when Titan had gone still, then shaken and taken a long minute to reset. "Yes," she said quietly. "We logged it as distraction." "That's not distraction," Hank said. "That's memory. That's the part of him still living in whatever blast put him in the ground on paper. You've been calling his loyalty a problem because you didn't know what it was attached to." He nodded at the dog leaning into Jack. "That right there is a soldier who's been walking around 5 years with half his soul missing," Hank finished, "and he just found the man the other half belongs to." The stillness broke under the smooth growl of a different engine. A black SUV with no markings slid up behind the K9 unit and stopped. The driver's door opened and a woman stepped out, coat dark, posture rigid. She walked to the top of the pier, flipped open a leather wallet, and showed a badge. "Sheriff Miller," she said. "Special Agent Laura Stone, FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force." Cole's gut clenched. "Ma'am, we got a call. I followed protocol. And in doing so, Sheriff, you stepped into a restricted federal observation," Stone said crisply. Her eyes swept once over Jack and the dog, then came back to him. "Our asset is on active duty. From here on, you and your department will stand down." "Asset," Ellie repeated under her breath, as if the word tasted wrong. Jenna forced herself to speak. "Agent Stone," she said, holding up the scanner. "His chip says K9E4 Echo and his handler, Mercer J, were both listed killed in action 5 years ago. This isn't a stray. This is something else." Stone didn't blink. "Combat records are messy," she said. "If they pulled him out later and reassigned him, someone failed to update a line in a database. It happens. We'll correct it." Hank huffed. "That line is 5 years of folks thinking he died in service," he said, "and 5 years of that dog waking up, waiting for a voice nobody let him hear." For the first time, a flicker of conflict crossed Laura Stone's face, but her tone stayed flat. "Regardless," she said, "K9E4 is federal property. So is Senior Chief Mercer for the moment. We are done here." She stepped aside, already lifting her phone to report up the chain. Up over the harbor, in a small office above a bait shop, Tyler T.J. Jones kept his camera trained on the pier through a rain-streaked window. He had filmed the arrival of the K9 unit, the dog's impossible hesitation, the way it broke and ran toward the stranger, the old vet's speech, the flash of an FBI badge. TJ's heart hammered as he glanced from the screen to his laptop. "Oh, Harbor Point," he whispered. "You have no idea what you're sitting on." His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Down on the pier, Jack and Echo stayed locked together, unaware that one local blogger was about to introduce their miracle to the rest of the world. Tyler T.J. Jones had posted plenty of clips to his Harbor Point blog, but none of them ever made his palms sweat. This one did. On his laptop screen, the shaky footage replayed fog, blue strobes, the K9 stalking down the pier, and then freezing, whining, and shoving his head into the chest of the silent stranger while the whole town forgot to breathe. Hank's voice followed in the audio, rough and certain. "That's not hesitation. That's memory." TJ hardly touched it. He trimmed dead air, kept every gasp and quiet. "Oh my God," left in Jack's broken whisper. "I've got you, Echo." Over the first frame, he dropped simple text. "Harbor Point, Oregon, Police K9, sent to stop a stranger. Watch what happens when a soldier's dog recognizes his ghost." Title: Guardians of Harbor Point. One last breath. Upload. He pushed the link to his small news site, then to every account he ran, adding a single hashtag, "Owash Harbor Point Miracle." At first, the counter crawled. 50 views, 70, 100. A deckhand shared it to a local Facebook group. A cousin in Portland reposted it with, "You need to see this dog." A retired Coast Guardsman added his own caption. "That's imprinting? I'd bet my last paycheck." Then the numbers began to spin. Comments stacked under the video faster than TJ could scroll. "My husband was K9 in Afghanistan. This feels like home and heartbreak." As a cop, that's not disobedience, that's recognition. If some policy tears them apart, that policy is wrong. An animal rescue page wrote, "You can train a dog to bite. You can't train him to forget his person." By morning, a regional news site and then a national show were replaying the clip between weather and politics. The dog and the soldier had become more than a video. They were someone's father, someone's son, someone's old war story suddenly alive again. And everyone watching knew, without needing details, how the ending should go. Agent Laura Stone did not need a TV to know the story had escaped. Her phone dragged her out of sleep in the narrow Harbor Point motel. 3 missed calls from FBI Public Affairs, 2 from DC, 1 from a Navy liaison who never called without a headache attached. She sat on the edge of the bed and answered. "Stone." "Ma'am, Saunders, PA," a strained voice said. "We've got a problem. A video from your pier went nuclear overnight. It's everywhere. And the narrative is fixed." "How bad?" she asked. "National shows, military blogs, pet accounts," he said. "They're all running the same line. A dead SEAL, a loyal K9 who refuses to attack, and the big bad feds about to yank them apart." He texted a link. Stone opened it. New angle, same punch. Harbor fog. The K9's approach, the stumble, the broken whine, Echo pressing all 90 pounds of himself into Jack Mercer's chest, as if he intended to disappear there. Someone had added a caption along the bottom. "He was trained to take down strangers. You can't train him to forget his family." Hank's gravelly explanation followed. On the side of the player, comments blurred past. "Dear FBI, don't be the villain here. That handler's buried enough. Let him keep the one who came back. I don't care what the file says. That's his dog." Stone lived in a world of risk matrices and protocols, but she also understood another kind of power when it rolled over her. This was the kind of story you could not fight cleanly. You either stood beside it, or you got buried under it. Her section chief called from Washington before the clip finished. "Tell me we're not about to seize a dog from a man half the country just adopted," he said by way of greeting. "Our observation is blown," she replied. Sheriff Miller walked straight into it. The trawler moved, the minute uniforms hit the pier. The weapons route will have to be rebuilt somewhere else. "So the op is ice," he said. "What's still hot is every phone I own. Veterans groups, animal folks, Navy brass, one particular senator whose wife adores German shepherds. They're all asking the same question. What happens to Echo?" Stone stared out the thin motel curtains. Down on the harbor, she could see people already wandering toward the pier, pausing at the end, looking at the empty bench as if a dog might still be waiting there. "By the book," she said, "K9E4 is equipment. He'd be reassigned to another handler. And we'd look like monsters," her boss finished. "We enforce the handbook, and we become the agency that stole a miracle from a wounded SEAL. That story writes itself." She saw again Jack's hand buried in Echo's fur, the dog's body gone loose with relief, like a soldier finally off duty. "Then we don't reassign him," she said. "We write up an immediate retirement, medical and compassionate grounds. We get Navy to sign off, maybe pin a medal to his vest. We say out loud what everyone already believes. We take care of our warriors, human and canine." Silence hummed between coasts. "You're recommending we give away a working K9 to a man who, on paper, died 5 years ago," he said. "I'm recommending we admit the paper is wrong," she answered. "The internet already has. We can be dragged to that conclusion, or we can walk there on purpose." Another exhale. "Draft the retirement request," he said. "Lupin Jag and Navy liaison. No promises on timing, but the direction is clear." "Yes, sir." "And Laura?" "Yes." "Whatever happens, do not let that little town write our ending for us again." The call clicked off. Agent Laura Stone put the phone down and looked back at the harbor. Harbor Point had been a dot on a map when she arrived. Overnight, it had become a stage the whole country was watching. Out there somewhere, a soldier and his dog were waiting for orders. For the first time in a long career, she intended to deliver the one that felt like mercy. Agent Laura Stone did not deliver good news often. Her work usually sounded like warnings and orders. But as she walked down Harbor Point's main street toward the pier, the thin folder in her hand felt almost light. The fog had finally burned off. Boats rocked gently in the harbor, gulls argued overhead, and the town looked as quiet as the postcards promised. Jack Mercer stood halfway down the pier with his back to the water. Echo, still wearing the vest that said Titan, sat pressed against his left leg, eyes half closed, nose tilted into the breeze as if he were memorizing peace. Sheriff Cole leaned on a piling nearby. Jenna and Ellie stood a little back. Hank sat on an overturned crate, cane hooked over his arm. Stone stopped at the head of the pier. "Senior Chief Mercer," she called. Jack looked up. Echo's eyes snapped open, then checked Jack's face before relaxing again. "Agent Stone," Jack replied. "You bring orders?" "In a manner of speaking," she said, glancing at the others. "If you don't mind, I'll give them right here." "This is as good a place as any," Hank said. Stone opened the folder. K9E4, she read. "Call sign Echo, is hereby removed from federal service and placed on permanent retirement status, effective immediately on medical and compassionate grounds." Jenna's hand flew to her mouth. Ellie's eyes filled. "Custody and care of K9 Echo," Stone continued, "are awarded to Senior Chief Jack Mercer, United States Navy, in recognition of their prior service as a team and the extraordinary circumstances of their reunion." She closed the folder. Harbor sounds rushed back into the quiet. "So that's it?" Jack asked softly. "They just give him back?" Stone met his gaze. "It took a lot of phone calls and more than one argument," she said. "But yes, he's yours. No one is going to show up in 6 months and ask for their dog." Something eased in Jack's shoulders. He looked down at Echo. "Hear that?" he murmured. "You're retired." Echo answered by thumping his tail against Jack's boot and leaning all his weight into him until Jack had to brace his stance. "Will he keep working?" Jenna asked. "Or is this really it?" "That's between you and him," Stone said. "The paperwork says he's out of the fight. If you help the sheriff later, that's local, not federal." Cole cleared his throat. "For the record," he said, "if you two ever feel like stopping by the station, nobody's going to complain." Ellie laughed once through her tears. "You think Harbor Point is going to let its guardians just disappear? Coffee's on me anytime you want a boot that doesn't rock." Across the street, TJ hovered with his camera lowered. He had filmed enough. This part, he decided, could belong only to them. "Agent Stone," Hank said, pushing himself to his feet. "I didn't expect Washington to listen." "Neither did I," she answered. "But every now and then the story is so clear even a file can't hide it." She turned back to Jack. "You should know," she said. "Once the dust settles, they're going to ask what you want next. Desk, training command, discharge. Your name and his are on a lot of screens." "Let them talk," Jack said. "They can keep the banquets." "You don't want to say?" "I've had enough missions that belong to other people," he said. "From here on out, I want one that belongs to us." He scratched behind Echo's ear. "Him, me, and whoever else needs a place to catch their breath," Jack added. "Maybe some other ghost with 4 legs who didn't land as lucky." Hank's eyes shone. "I know a few fields waiting for fences," he said. "We'll talk." Stone closed the folder for good. "There's a Coast Guard bird inbound in an hour," she said. "They'll take you both back to base, get you checked out and debriefed, and hand you that stack of decisions." She hesitated, then reached into her coat and pulled out a small metal case. "One last piece," she said. Inside lay a brushed metal tag on a short length of chain. The letters were worn, but clear. K9E4, Echo Handler, Mercer, J. "We pulled it from an evidence locker," Stone said quietly. "Someone bagged it after the blast. Nobody quite knew what to do with it. It seemed wrong to leave it there." Jack took the tag with careful fingers, thumb tracing the stamped letters. "Thank you," he said. Stone nodded once. "Thank you," she replied. For finishing what the report said was impossible. She stepped back, leaving Jack, Echo, and Harbor Point, with a future that, for the first time in a long time, was not written entirely in someone else's ink. Down the pier, the empty bench where a stranger had once sat alone waited in the sun, Soon, the town would decide how to mark it. For now, it was enough that the man and the dog who had turned Harbor Point upside down were walking back towards solid ground together. The Coast Guard helicopter was still only a distant thump when Harbor Point began to gather. Ellie flipped the diner sign to closed and stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. Down at the docks, deckhands cut engines. A couple of kids came pounding down the hill, drawn by the noise and the story half the country already knew. TJ jogged with them, camera bag at his hip, but for once the lens cap stayed on. On the pier, Echo heard the helicopter first. His ears pricked, body leaning toward the sound. "Yeah, I hear it," Jack murmured, fingers buried in the fur at his neck. "Last ride, partner." Agent Laura Stone stood with a folder under one arm, hair whipped by the growing rotor wash. "They'll set down in the gravel lot," she said. "Then it's air station, doctors, debrief, and more paperwork than anyone deserves." Jack managed a wry half-smile. "So, a normal day." The white and orange Jayhawk dropped through the clouds and flared over the harbor, sending spray and grit swirling. It settled in the lot with a roar. A crewman in orange stepped out, crouched under the spinning blades, and waved toward the pier. "Mercer," Stone called over the noise. "Time to move." "Give us a minute," Sheriff Cole said. He wasn't in full uniform, just jeans and a Harbor County windbreaker, badge clipped at his belt. "If Washington doesn't mind, this town would like to say goodbye," he added. Stone hesitated, then nodded once. 5 minutes. Hank Blackwood reached Jack first, cane ticking on the planks. "A fair winds and following seas, son," he said, offering his hand. Jack took it. The old sailor's grip was still iron. "Couldn't have done any of this without you," Jack said. "Sure you could," Hank snorted. "But it would have taken longer for the rest of us to catch up. You remember something for me." "What's that?" "There's a difference between hurting and harming," Hank said. "You hurt the right folks. That's called justice where I come from." A ghost of a smile touched Jack's mouth. "I'll keep that in mind." Hank bent with a creak and scratched Echo between the ears. "You watch his back," he told the dog. "He's worth the trouble." Echo answered with a soft huff and a lean that nearly tipped the old man off balance. Jenna Reed came next. Echo's old vest folded over one arm. Without the big K9 at her side, she looked strangely unfinished. "I was supposed to be your handler," she said to Echo, voice catching. "I thought you were stubborn. Turns out you were just loyal to someone the paperwork forgot." Echo stepped forward and nudged her hand with his nose, then gave one slow, deliberate lick to her wrist. Jenna laughed once, wiped at her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "Okay, I deserve that," she said. She held the vest out to Jack and peeled off the Harbor County K9 patch. "Souvenir, and just so you know, Sheriff and I are not above calling in a favor if Harbor Point ever needs its guardians again." "Wouldn't dream of screening your calls," Jack replied. Ellie Harper was last. She didn't bring menus or coffee pots this time, only a foil-wrapped bundle and a metal thermos. "Road food," she said. "I'm not letting a Navy man leave town on an empty stomach. That would be bad for business." Jack accepted both. "Yes, ma'am." Ellie's eyes shone, but her voice was steady. "You came in here like trouble in a wet jacket," she said. "I called the sheriff on you, remember?" "I noticed," Jack said. "But you left Harbor Point better than you found it," she finished. "That's all we ask of storms around here. You remember, you've got a booth, back corner, good view of the water. You ever need a place where nobody cares what your file says? That's it." Jack's throat tightened. "We'll be back," he said simply. Ellie laid her hand briefly against Echo's cheek. "You guard him," she whispered. "He'll handle the rest." TJ hovered at the edge of the group as they approached. "Not filming?" Jack asked. "Already did my damage," TJ said, patting the camera bag. "This part's just for Harbor's Point." He pressed a small flash drive into Jack's palm. "Back up at the clip before the internet mauled it," TJ said, "in case someday you want to remember how you two broke my server." "Thanks," Jack said, "and for not making us into something we're not." TJ shook his head. "Buddy, I wish I was good enough to invent a story like you and that dog. I just hit upload." Stone stepped closer, rotor wash tugging at her coat. "Time," she said quietly. Jack nodded, then looked down at Echo. "Ready?" he asked. Echo's answer was simple. He stepped in tight at Jack's side, eyes on the waiting helicopter, tail giving one steady thump. Together they walked toward the roaring blades. At the bottom of the ramp, Jack turned. Harbor Point stood there in a loose half-circle, Ellie with her apron strings fluttering, Cole with his hands braced on his hips, Jenna rubbing at her eyes, Hank straight as an old mast, TJ shading his gaze with one hand, though he wasn't filming. Jack lifted his free hand in a brief, clean salute. Then he and Echo disappeared into the aircraft. The ramp closed, the engines roared, and the Jayhawk rose, dragging a whirlwind of fog and salt up with it. The helicopter banked out over the harbor and into the pale sky. They watched until it was a speck, then nothing. On the pier, the bench at the very end sat empty. For the first time since anyone could remember, it didn't look like a place for a lonely stranger to stare at the water. It looked like the beginning of a story Harbor Point would be telling for years to come. Spring came late to the Oregon coast, but when it finally arrived, Harbor Point bloomed in small, stubborn ways. Wildflowers pushed through cracks above the harbor. The air smelled less of diesel and more of salt and sun-warmed wood. At the far end of the pier, the splintered bench no longer belonged to a nameless stranger. The town council argued about what to do with it for half a meeting. Then Ellie showed up with coffee, Hank with an old sailor's knot, framed in driftwood, and the rest was obvious. A small bronze plaque gleamed now on the backrest, polished by curious fingertips. It read, "For the guardians who watch over us, seen and unseen, and for the loyalty that guides them home, welcome back." People came by in the evenings to sit a while. Some brought dogs, some brought memories. More than a few brought private hurts they never said out loud. Inside the diner, Ellie kept one corner table reserved in a quieter way. On the wall above it hung 3 framed photos. The first was a still from TJ's video. Echo frozen 3 feet from Jack on the pier, eyes wide with recognition. The second showed the day the plaque went up. Half the town crowded on the dock. The third arrived months later, in a plain envelope with no return address. It showed a fenced pasture under a big sky. In the foreground, Echo stood at the side of a woman in a wheelchair, her hand resting in his fur. Behind them, a veteran in a ball cap walked slowly along a dirt path. At the edge of the frame, a dark-haired man in a faded navy hoodie leaned on a fence post, watching it all. On the back, in Jack's compact handwriting, were 6 words. "Work in progress, you helped start it." Ellie cried over the sink where no one could see, then framed the photo and hung it on the wall. Out past the last gas station, where the coastal hills rolled inland, that picture had a name: Echo Ridge. It was not fancy. A gravel drive, a long, low barn turned into kennels and a training hall, 2 small cabins, a fire pit ringed with mismatched chairs, enough land for dogs to run and for men and women to remember they were more than what the war had taken. Jack worked sunrise to dark most days. At first, it was just him, Echo, and one local kid who knew more about fence posts than firearms. Then Hank showed up with advice on drainage ditches and a suspicious number of spare boards. Veterans arrived quietly, a swimmer who couldn't step near open water, a medic who still woke at every small sound, a Marine whose service dog had died and who swore she'd never bond with another. Echo greeted them all the same way, steady, patient, no questions. He showed new dogs how to walk beside a wheelchair without pulling, how to stand between their person and a crowded doorway, how to lean just enough when a nightmare made hands shake. On some evenings, when the porch light glowed against the dark, Jack sat on the steps with Echo at his feet and listened to the quiet. Sometimes he thought about the way the file still read: incident, explosion, killed in action. Then he looked at the dog snoring lightly against his boots and decided some reports weren't meant to be corrected. They were meant to be outlived. Back in Harbor Point, life went on. Sheriff Cole chased more drunks than smugglers. Jenna trained a new K-9 partner, a young Malinois with more energy than sense, and kept a worn Harbor County patch in her locker as a reminder of the dog who had taught her what loyalty looked like. Ellie poured coffee, told tourists the short version of the story, and kept the long version in her heart. Every so often, when the mail truck came late, TJ would pop into the diner waving a tablet. "You're trending again," he'd say, pulling up a clip from some show replaying the video, the bench, the plaque, the ranch. Ellie would roll her eyes, but she always watched to the end. The story never seemed to wear out. People kept needing to hear that a bond could survive fire and time and bureaucracy, that love could pull someone back from the edge of disappearing, that a soldier could come home twice, once in body and once in spirit. On a quiet Sunday when the breakfast rush had faded and the harbor lay soft under a pale sky, Ellie flipped the sign to closed for an hour and sat by the window with her Bible and a cup of coffee. She thought of Hank and his cane, of Cole trying so hard to get things right, of Jenna with her new partner, of TJ typing late into the night. She thought of a man and a dog standing at the edge of the world, finally handed orders that sounded like mercy. She whispered a simple prayer for them all, and for anyone who ever felt invisible until a pair of loyal eyes found them. If this story finds you there, she would say if you were sitting across from her, know this: you are not forgotten. There is a hand that still sees, a bond that still holds, and a home you haven't reached yet. If Jack and Echo could step out of the fog of duty into a life of healing, then there is hope for you too. If their journey touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. And if you want to claim this blessing over your life and over the people you love, write a quiet amen somewhere only you and God can see. Stay gentle. Stay brave. And may you always have a guardian, seen or unseen, walking one step closer than the fear behind you.